告诉我们在职场上的你告诉我们，我们在职场上是像点一盏灯一样的，是放在桌子上面，能够照亮别人。说让我们真是能够常常提醒我们自己，说我们不是只为自己的事业，不是只为自己的钱财，不是只为自己的头衔，我们更重要的是能够见证你自己的荣耀，能够扩充你自己的国度。说常常提醒我们，让我们知道。不论是在我们什么样子的年龄的阶段，主啊，你这个使命放在我们身上，就是最重要的托付。我们常常愿意，真是在你面前能够被你提醒，能够引导。我们谢谢你，把今天的中午的时间都交在你面前，求你与我们同在。祷告祈求奉主耶稣的名，阿门。
Amen。
好，把时间。
好的 ，Jason， 你要开始吗？
你开始了。
好的 ，OK， 大家好。我们这个 conflict resolution, I'm going to use English because we want to encourage us to practice English and apply this in our workplace. So conflict resolution for win-win relationship at work, a very popular topic. Whenever we have people, we are bound to have problem because we all think differently, different personality, different interests, and we'll go deeper later on. What are some root causes for conflicts? And how do conflicts come about? What are some impacts? And what are some outcomes? And how can we resolve them in a smart way so that we can work toward win-win? And the most important is building good relationship. Is the slide showing okay? Okay. So if you look at the cartoons on the right, it's very illustrative. We all know this cartoon well, right? And number 6, depending on where you stand, you may look at it as a 6 or you may look at it as a 9. And that is very true in the real world. So often, whether at home, at work, or in the community, the same right thing could be looked at differently because of your point of view being different. And then when you say yes or no, being different and disagree with each other. And when working together isn't quite working. So that is where conflict may come in. So let's take a look at that. Is it really true that conflict could cause us not to work well together? So I challenge to say it's not necessarily the truth. So we're going to talk about that. So our purpose today is to leverage the different communication skill. And there's a lot of different communication skill we won't cover today, but just some examples. And then particular conflict resolution strategy to work toward the right outcome. And the overall goal, like I mentioned earlier, it's really to build trusted and win-win relationship. That's ultimately the most important. For me, growing up, working for 33 years, for a long time, I focused so much on tasks, results, projects, getting things done, because I'm a high achiever, want to get things done. And I really learned in a painful, in a difficult way, and realized that it isn't about the project or the work. It's more about the people, the relationship. When I build good, trusted relationship, projects get resolved much easier and faster. So when we have conflict, it's an opportunity to build relationship. You may disagree with me and say conflicts hurt relationship, but let me tell you, conflicts are very natural and expected. It's how you handle conflict that would determine how it impacts your relationship. I suggest that conflicts are actually many times good for us in building the right relationship. So we'll talk about why that is the case. So we'll look into the reasons. And then last time when Holly shared, we already covered the 5 different ways to resolve conflict. And I'll cover very briefly the 1 to 10. We don't have enough time to cover all the details. So this is the Thomas Kilmann, and George is going to cover a lot more in detail in the late July session, which is great because George was trained and he's going to give us some tests. So we covered this very briefly last time. And whether you are cooperative or assertive or not. So it's a 2x2 matrix and then gives you the 5 different ways. So I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I'm going to invite Bella. She really liked these 5 strategies, both in the English and in the Chinese. And we went through the different scenario. When would you use which strategy? Because it's applicable depending on the situation. And of course, we want to work toward win-win if at all possible. And that takes more time. So now we're going to ask Bella to read her poem. She translated and then she really understood what it means. And Bella, 请你帮我们读你的诗是什么样去了解这个 Thomas Kuhlman model. 请。
Thank you very much for Elaine, our mentor, gave me this opportunity to translate. Actually, it's her original PPT. Yeah, I will try to read in Chinese, of course. Okay. 个性观点因人异，冲突争吵也难避。管理模式有5种，愿君懂得如何选。选择逃避是其一，未免竞争伤和气。闭门高悬不战旗，看似无争实无益。消极顺应是其二，自己利益不敢起。委曲求全心不已，不出全力随他意。双方妥协是第三，不冷不热不开启。看似无不分输和赢，其实就是和稀泥。激烈竞争是其次，我赢你输是目的。争强好胜虽得意，失了朋友有何益？相互协作是其五，胜负输赢不在意。双方达标共得利，互惠双赢成知己。1、2、3、4、5选项，每种都有其特色，适用场合各不同，用的巧妙是最佳。当然第5最有效，化解冲突人皆知，心知还需行动配，只有实践出真知。个性差异起争吵，协力合作免纠纷。海阔天空就一步，柳暗花明一念间。
谢谢 Bella， 好精彩！我觉得等一下我们继续讨论的，在这个诗里面已经也总结到了哈，不只是心知道，而且要实践出来。谢谢，那我们也期待之后7月底给我们更深入的认识这 Thomas Kuhlman 的5个 model。好的，所以呢，谢谢 Bella 给我们这样的一个很好的启发。所以我们回到let's go back to the Webster Dictionary definition. What is conflict? So the conflict definition is a sharp disagreement as of interest or ideas. It's very, very likely every day you can have multiple conflict with same people or multiple people because we have different interests, different personality, different perspective. So again, when we have people, we're going to have problem, and that's okay. That's a good thing to know about. The most important is how you handle them. How do you face it? Because conflict truly really help us build relationship because you get to know each other better, learn how to communicate, and come up with better solution that you couldn't do on your own. So in the Bible, there are many conflicts, and we know one very famous one between Paul and Barnabas. They were on a missions trip that in Acts chapter 15. They had such a sharp disagreement, exactly the dictionary definition. They ended up parting company. They couldn't stay on the same trip together. So it's that's avoiding, right? They did not address the issue. They avoid, both just left the orange on the table. No one got any piece of the orange. So they just avoided it. So is conflict always bad? If you look at this cartoon, it truly shows the bad side of conflict. And I really encourage us to look at conflict in a very different way. I don't believe it's all bad. In fact, if you handle it right, I think most conflict could be really good. And we're going to explain why. So I have this whole conflict resolution journey 1 through 10, 10部曲, and we don't have time to go through the whole thing. This is a few talks. I'll just cover a few of those in purple today. Start with number 1. Of course, we want to build unity. We want everyone to work together well. So we'll go through one by one at a time. So we know very well from 1 Corinthians chapter 12. We have one body, but we have different parts. So just like when we are as a church body, it's a one body and we all have different gifts. Same thing when you're in a family or at work. We are functioning as one cohesive unit. And some people are better at execution. Some people are better at strategy. So we have different body part function. The goal is number 1, unity. One body, one faith, one mind, one spirit joining us together. So if we can start that journey 1 through 10, number 1 is to think of it as one unity. So I always love the phrase unity in diversity. Recently, we talked a lot about racial discrimination or some Asian hate type kind of concern. Ultimately, it's still one human race. It's not different races, right? One race. So how can we really build unity in diversity? So what are some root causes for conflict? So we know very well. So there's actually 2 types. There's the real conflict, and there's some called perceived conflict. The real conflict are when we have different needs that are not met. We have differences in our goal, our interest, our personality, right? So in my marriage, Dominic and I have been married for 35 years. As you can tell, one person likes to talk, one is quiet. One is very fast, one is taking the time to think carefully. So we have very different personality, but it doesn't mean that we have conflicts. We have times that we agree to disagree. We know to appreciate each other's differences and admire each other's characteristics, while we can complement each other. So that's a very good example. When we are different, we don't have to live under negative, bad conflict. And then when we have limited resources at work, right? Your budget for time, for money, for equipment, all those are limited. So we all care about our own projects. So you tend to have conflicts. So how are you going to handle that? You have different style, different values, and different culture, right? When we have different ethnic background. So those are real conflicts. And when you have needs that are not met because of our differences. There's some perceived conflicts where we misunderstand each other. We make assumption in the wrong way. We have poor communication skill. We're not connecting. Even when we're thinking of the same thing, we may come across differently. So those are really perceived conflicts. So those we should really handle well, because help to communicate better, listen to each other. And then the perceived conflict that came from ignorance. If we don't understand their culture, we make the wrong assumption and we thought they're rude, but that's how their culture works. So we need to learn and get educated. We make mistake, errors, or some tradition, historical tradition, which could be wrong, right? Prejudice, pride, jealousy, or poor organization structure. Later, we'll talk about personal and organizational conflict. So if the organization is designed in a way that tend to cause conflict, that's perceived conflict. So the real conflict are the ones that are difficult to overcome, but perceived conflict is actually easier and need to be resolved in a smart way. If you can communicate better, design the organization better, power struggle, right? This is the me, myself, and I. It's about me. I need to go higher up. I need to beat you down. So all that is not what we want to talk about, because we want servant leadership. How do we help others to be successful, and that together as a team, we can be successful. So we apply the right principle. You could avoid a lot of these perceived conflict. And then if we have certain hostility towards certain project or certain people, and then we ended up accusing other people or get emotional, because that's really a major concern in conflict. So whenever we get into conflict, resolution, the most important is to really calm. And we have some tips later on to help us. And to manage our own emotion, listen to yourself, talk to yourself, think to yourself. Why are you thinking this way? Why are you feeling this way? So that we don't get blindsided by all these perceived conflicts. And then sometimes, especially during COVID, we have a lot of tension and stress. Always facing the computer is not easy. You're working longer hours than you're in the office. So how can we find healthy ways to release our tension instead of causing these perceived conflicts? When you have a bad day coming home or after a long day or long trip, and then you may get mad at even the dog and yell at the dog. So those are all perceived conflicts. So let's be careful to differentiate the two. Real conflicts, we need to learn to accept them and work out how to solve the differences. And then perceived conflict, we should try to avoid them by better understanding each other, listening, and better understanding yourself and managing our own emotion. So when is conflict bad? When the outcome is bad is when it's very messy, very unpleasant, as I'm sure we've all experienced, very hurtful. It really damaged our relationship, damaged our lives, and it takes a long time to heal. As you can imagine, like an emotional bank account. Any conflict, it's a huge withdrawal from the bank account of your relationship. And it takes extra, double, multiple fold effort to really overcome that withdrawal in order to invest in a positive deposit. So instead of getting better, we end up getting very bitter and very resentful of each other. So it's very, very difficult. So we really want to avoid that. So when could the conflict be good? And in my own experience and my own journey, I really see this as a positive opportunity. When you have conflict, it's when people expressing their opinion being different. Because I believe when we have multiple people sharing and solving a project, it's good when everyone has a different perspective, then you can listen. And you ended up solving a problem with a solution that could be out of the box that you couldn't come up with on your own, because we have different perspectives. So 1 + 1 is greater than 3. So I like to look at conflict that way, for the real conflict when we have different opinion, not the perceived conflict, right? So conflict itself in many ways could be neutral, right? Depending on how you handle them. And we want to work toward a positive outcome. And conflict is actually necessary, and it's helpful for us to become better of ourselves, better project resolution, better environments, because we get to know each other better. And when we can handle it well, it requires very good communication skill and good relationship. So it's both the input and the output are valuable. So I like for us to think about conflict. So in the 1 to 10 journey, there are 2 outcomes, either bad or good. So let's work toward the good outcome. So what happens when we have unresolved conflict? When you don't talk about it, you just avoid and just kind of leave it alone. It could build up misunderstanding and then cause stress. Recently, there are a few times, even in our ministry, working with coworkers or with my mentees, and when I didn't hear from them for a long time, if I started to wonder and assume that they're not being responsible or accusing them, then it's going to damage the relationship. And then what happened is when we actually have an open communication, then we align and understand what happened. Why are they not available for a while? So really helps to address the conflict in a proactive and a positive way. Otherwise, we'll get very stressed. You'll be physically tired and stressed, emotionally drained. Psychologically, you get fearful. I remember there's a relationship in my life for a long time, one of my extended family member. It was very difficult. Every time I see them, I'll be like a mouse facing a cat. I was so worried. You just had the whole shadow because you're not resolving the conflict. Socially, you feel very isolated. financially stressed, and then spiritually. In fact, spiritual is the most valuable resource to help us to handle conflict in a positive way. So there are 3 myths in conflict. We just cover some examples, right? We thought conflicts are bad. We should avoid them. I disagree with that. I welcome when we have differences. Let's get to know each other. Let's discuss, communicate in a positive way, build good relationship, draw our distance closer, and come up with solution by incorporating everyone's point of view to a degree that works. Number 2 myth, conflicts are natural, cannot be prevented or avoided. So like I mentioned earlier, many of these perceived conflicts are misunderstanding, selfishness, all those, many of them can be avoided. And it's good to avoid the perceived conflicts. And number 3, we think it's zero-sum game. Yeah, we only have $10,000 budget and that's it. And we can either give to you or give to me or split or somehow. But there could be ways that we can make the pie bigger. There may be creative ways that 1 + 1 is greater than 3. So it isn't always zero-sum game. If we can put our heads together, we may come up with solutions that actually give us more benefit than it is. So we call that making the pie bigger. 把饼做大, huh? So these are the 3 myths. So on our journey 1, 2, 3 so far. And then if you look at this cartoon, you can see them really frustrated, right? Do you resonate with your own experience sometimes? You should follow my advice because I am right. It's about me and I always show the best result. You should follow me. After all, it works for me. It's got to work for you. But maybe I'm not you. Oh, don't be ridiculous. Everyone is like me. So one of my real major mistake during my career was I was a high achiever, always worked really hard. And I always made the wrong assumption. I said, I can do it. I'm sure everybody else can do it. I said, if I can do it, I would expect others to do the same. And I would not expect others to do more than what I can do. So I was so ignorant. That was such a bad mistake. So these are the universal fears when we face conflict. We are worried about being criticized, rejected, failing, losing what I have, or not getting what I want. So these are typical fears that once we face certain conflict, we get very tense. So we need to look at each one of these in a positive way, right? It's okay to be criticized. That's how I can learn. And that takes a lot of humility and courage, but it's worth it. When you're willing to listen, people love to work with you a lot more. Even though they may be wrong, still hear them out and we can talk through it. And I also learned over the years of my career, in a way, I can prove them wrong by my action. Actions speak louder than words. We don't have to argue about it. For example, there is time that people find me to be quote unquote hypocritical. They say, how can Elaine be so positive? I think she's a hypocrite. Even when we have difficult project and difficult people, and she's still positive. So I'm not going to argue and tell them that I truly think that we can deal with it. So I am just going to prove them wrong and show them by my action, right? Rejection. The good news is we need to know our identity is not defined by what people receive us or not. It's really defined by our own identity in Christ. For us as Christian, we are God's children, right? We are princes and princesses, and you can touch your crown. So if you know your identity, you don't need to worry about being rejected. And I know we're human beings, we'll get emotional. So we learn to face the differences, even failing, learn how to get ourselves up. And the good news is God's grace is sufficient for us. And we may worry about losing what we have or not getting what we want. So then you come to God and say, is this something I need? Or is it my greed that I just want it? It's not really what I need. So in the counter approach, instead of being so fearful of those conflicts, how about we think about being curious instead of critical? I can ask questions. curious why you think this way. Oh, I'd like to learn more about your culture. I'm curious how you look at this project. This is your approach. So can ask good questions. And we learn to be more caring instead of crushing, right? Because when we get tense, we tend to bring up a wall or bring our weapon and try to crush and get into a defensive mode or argumentative mode. So pray that we learn to be caring, look at from their perspective and see why they think this way. And then I like to connect before correct. Even though you may be right, we need to be slow and careful and respectful. We always say praise in public and chastise or make suggestion in private. So making correction in private is better than in public. And try to connect. And this is where relationship comes in. If you have good relationship and make a connection, like I said in the very beginning, 有关系就没有关系了. You really focus on building a trusted relationship. It's much easier. After you connect, then you correct. And that applies to parenting. A lot of times when I give the parenting talks, so important, building the relationship. And then ask instead of assume. So many times I know I was so wrong, making the wrong assumption. I learned not to assume, I learned to ask. Even if you may know the answer, still good to ask, because then you're in a conversation. You ask open-ended question, not just yes, no question. Why would you think this way? How does this work? And what are your thoughts? I like to listen to you. Tell me more. These are the 3 very powerful, attractive words in English language. Tell me more. Wow. If you're interested to ask, tell me more, people love to talk to you. You know, in general, people like to listen to themselves, right? Unfortunately, we really should practice James 1:19 to be slow to speak, quick to listen, and slow to be angry. So tell me more. God gave us 2 ears. We want to listen more. What happened next? People love to tell you more. So those are very powerful counter approaches. So in conflict response, there are 3 phrases that I want to remind us of and see where we want to focus on and where we want to avoid. There's something called a peace flicker. They're not real peace. You fake it because you're avoiding it. You flight, you flee, or you freeze. This is when you focus so much on yourself. I feel hurt. I escape. I don't want to deal with it. And it's only temporary. I can avoid it and just be relieved from it. And I'm not talking to them. So it's poor communication, try to avoid or deny or making excuses. So actually, when we keep avoiding and peace faking, especially in marriages, it's pretty dangerous because it would get worse and get worse, multiple fold before you know it. So it's got to be good communication. So you're postponing and delaying solving the problem. So number 2 is the peace breaking, right? This is when you compete and I want to be winning and I want you to be losing. That's when you fight. So that, of course, is going to damage your relationship. And this is when you focus on others and pinpoint and accuse them because it's all their fault. Remember, when you point one finger at someone, you have 3 fingers pointing at yourself. So we got to be careful about that. And especially when you fight in public, that is the worst. Remember, praise in public, and you would recommend or chastise in private, right? And when you go in attack mode or defensive, being very critical, all these damage the relationship and also damage for us as Christian, our testimony would be so negative, right? We think about winning and we want to be in control. Blaming on others, being very intimidating. I remember there were days in my 33 years career, I've done some of that. Even some people go extreme, verbal abuse or assault, or gossiping behind people's back, slander, violence, hatred. So those are very extreme. And I pray that we don't do much of these, if any, hopefully not. So the 3rd one is the best, right? Peacemaking. This is real peace and let the blessings flow. And this is when we focus on resolving conflict God's way. So instead of focusing on myself, me, myself, and I, or focusing on accusing others, like the above two, we focus on WWJD. What would Jesus do? Right? What would God say that we should do? And how can I build personal relationship? And a lot of times, these are better addressed when you're privately one-on-one. And how can I restore and build that relationship? And if you already had challenges from peace faking and peace breaking, it would take courage for us to apologize, because we need the healing, right? That's a whole topic. How do you restore that relationship? And it starts with apologizing. Even if you only have 1% wrong, apologize for your 1%. And that we learn to overlook some minor details that are not as important and be more gracious. So I always talk about our marriage. Dominic and I married for 35 years. And a lot of the early years in our marriage, even when I was wrong, Dominic was so gracious to apologize. And I learned from him how not to just let the other spouse apologize. I take on my responsibility as well. So what would God do? And what does God do? How would he use conflicts? Why would God allow problems and conflicts and trials in our life? So God created each one of us, and he knows, and he designed each one of us being so different and unique, which is very, very exciting, right? Because we know one person is the same as anyone else. So that's when we learn to appreciate and admire each other's differences. So what does God want us to do when we come up with problems or issues? Number one, we want to trust God to help us to see the conflict is not just by accident. It's really an opportunity for us to get to know each other, build a relationship, and figure out solutions that are outside of the box. Second principle, God does not tell us all that we want to know. He tells us all that we need to know. So according to the Bible, has so much wisdom. It's our life manual. It tells us all different situations. How do we apply the biblical principle, especially in conflicts? Third principle, your view of God affects your trust in God. So how you really think of God in helping us grow, it really makes a difference how we can trust and obey God. So in conflict, you can decide, do you want to trust on your own, or do you want to trust in God? One of my favorite hymns is Trust and Obey. And I even have hand motions for it, right? Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. In my 40 years being a Christian, I can study so much about the Bible and applications. And a lot of times it comes back to these two words. Are you willing to trust and obey God, especially in conflict? So I remind us to do that. So those are the three principles that God will use conflicts. And ultimately, I believe all the conflicts and all adversity and challenges that we go through, I always said God is very Asian. He does not waste anything. So he would use our adversity to build up our character, ABC. And I remember so many of my conflicts at work over the years, in 33 years of career. And the most darkest moment, the most difficult ones are the ones and the times that I grew the most. I really experienced the ABC. And that's when Romans 5:3-5 came alive. It really helped me to experience these three verses in real time, in real life. And I sometimes have very strange thinking. I say we should, quote unquote, enjoy the suffering, enjoy the conflict. I don't mean to ask God and say, oh, God, give me conflict. That's not what I mean. When we run into conflict, which is often when we have suffering, which is 80-90% in our life, oftentimes, we might as well get the most out of our conflict and suffering and challenges. and grow our character. So in Romans 5, it says that we have glory in our sufferings. In Chinese, it's even better. 在患难中也是欢欢喜喜的, which is so beautiful, right? Suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. That's the ABC. Adversity builds character. And character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame. And the good news is we're not struggling on our own. The Holy Spirit will help us. So when we have conflict, we learn to seek to understand. These are some options. We may meet in the middle, or we may meet on your side, or we may meet later, or sometimes it may meet on my side, right? These are different options. The later is a very good option, especially if you are tense, you're emotional, the whole room is very frustrated, you want to take a break, take a pause, and come back to it later when people are more calm and manage our emotion better. So these are 4 basic steps that a lot of conflict resolution classes would tell us. First, think about, okay, what happened? How did that conflict came about? What happened? What did I do? What's my portion of the responsibility? And what does the Bible say? How should I look at resolving the conflict God's way? And then what do I do next? So what's the action plan? So the next few slides, I'm going to give you some practical ways how we can prevent and control conflict, and what are some 1, 2, 3 steps to help implement into our real conflict. And then we'll go into a small group discussion. So at a personal level, we want to learn a lot of active listening. That's reflecting, summarizing what they think, what they feel. You truly listen from their perspective with empathy, feel how they feel, with respect, with acceptance, and feeling vulnerable, that you're willing to share your own mistake or share your own shortcoming. People are a lot more attractive to people who are vulnerable and humble than people who are arrogant and know it all and have it all. So it's very powerful when you're willing to humble and make that personal connection while still being assertive, like we learned in the last few months. So at the organization level, so earlier when we said this perceived conflict, when you don't have a good organization design, sometimes organization designed in a way that they try to introduce intentional conflict to help them kind of compete and improve better. Sometimes that could be detrimental to the organization and the relationship. So you have to think about the structure, how to avoid that. How can it help to nurture teamwork and relationship as opposed to competition and beating each other up? So when you have poor organizational design, people tend to be defensive. So if we have good organization design, we could nurture win-win environment and the whole culture, especially the leaders, the top down. If you demonstrate win-win, you demonstrate humility, you demonstrate your vulnerability while being assertive, that is going to be a good influence to help others. And then, of course, to have some good process, procedures and policies that really help to set boundaries so that we don't have to cause a lot of unnecessary perceived conflicts. So having some control and some SOP are very helpful. So getting to some practical, some 4 use case example that you can consider in conflict resolution, and that would encourage honor. As an example, think about when you may want to start resolving the conflict, because it's not always the right time. So we need to think about the right time. Choose when the people are in good mood, or they just got something done and really had a good accomplishment. It applies to the family as well, right? When you're talking to your spouse or your children, pick a right time, then the right place, at the right, with the right approach, instead of accusing. Remember all the tips that we had earlier. So here's an example. Amy, I'd like to talk about the way you treated me earlier. Is now a good time, or should we talk after our team meeting? So there's something you're not comfortable with, and now you're being assertive. You want to address it at the right time. So this is an example of how you can approach that. And then learn when to stop, right? Remember what we said, if it's very tense, it's okay to wait. A lot of times it's better to wait when we're not at the right mood or the right setting or not the right people, then we can wait. So here what you could say, I think we better stop here. Things are getting pretty tense. We need to continue this conversation, but let's take a break for now. Maybe we'll think of some other ideas in the meantime to help resolve this. So this is a powerful statement you can consider using. Number 3 example, learn how to listen, right? Conflicts represent opportunity to get to know each other and to help each other grow and help each other to be better. So listening, especially the positive affirmation, really help to build relationship. I really like, Vincent, how you think about this problem. I like how you manage the Zoom, so methodical and so systematic, and helping us to have the best meeting environment. So call out what people do wrong, do right, right? Don't just say, oh, wonderful, terrific. So there's a whole communication skill on how to affirm people. Describe what they do well, and even use character word. I really appreciate how Jason has such good servant leadership. We had our coworkers meeting in an hour, and he quickly already planned out the whole quarter's series topic. He is so responsible. So put character words so we can honor them and respect them. Start with that, and you know the communication skill with the sandwich technique. That's an example, right? So actually, next few months and next year, I'll be doing a lot of workshops and recording on communication because it's such a deep and wide topic. So we want to really practice that. However good you are, if you don't communicate in a wise way, you don't ask in a wise way, you're missing out a lot of opportunity. So here's a statement you could say. I understand you would treat Thomas differently. Your ideas make sense. At this point, I'm the one who has to make the decision, and I'm going to emphasize something different. And I would appreciate your ideas, and we can talk about it. So this is very tricky, right? Being assertive and stating what your observation is, and then how can we still try to listen and come up with some discussion and decision together. And the final use case example is to ask genuine questions. These open-ended questions can open the doors for more positive and constructive communication. And there's a lot of skill on asking the right question at the right time and a good question. And the very powerful skill is when you ask question, we talked about it last month, is when you ask a question to even help guide the discussion toward what you have in mind to begin with. That's very powerful. And then even asking question to arrive at a conclusion that they think that they come up with and they own it as well. And that's very powerful. So here are some examples. Do you feel as though we resolved the issue we discussed this morning? Or did you have some further thoughts? Always tell me more. What's next, right? How do you feel about the issue we discussed this morning? Or what other thoughts would you like to share? So what's the difference between these two questions? The first question answer is yes and no. So that's closed question. So we want to avoid that. So we want to ask the 5W and the 1H, right? The how, what, where, when, why. So those questions would help us to have a dialogue. So it's not just yes, no, it's how do you feel about this issue? Finally, a couple of quick way, we're moving from 1 through 5 now. We just did 4 use cases. So number 5 simple praise step. This is very, very practical. Whenever you have a conflict, you think about, okay, what is positive? What is something we both agree? Start with the mutual common ground. That's always good start. We agree with this. Let's list those. 正的, we both agree. Okay, reverse. What do we disagree on? Sometimes we may agree to disagree. At least we get to list those out. What are the 反的? What do we disagree? And then A, how can we now spend more time to think through these disagreements? Why you think this way? and how we can come up with a win-win. Ideally, right? Sometimes maybe win-lose or lose-win, that's okay. So that's aggregate. Our collective thoughts come up with a joint solution, 和. And then Y is to yield, especially yielding to the Holy Spirit, helping us to let God orchestrate and guide us. So what are some options? What are some alternatives? What are some different methods? We'll yield to listen to each other. And then finally come up with the solution, S. So that's a prayer model, right? That think from the team's benefit perspective, not just me, myself, and I. So if we do it this way, what are the benefits? If you could explain the benefit of certain solution, there's no reason people don't go along. So coming from, we call the rhythm, right? What's in it for me? WIFM. What's in it for me? In the American corporate culture, always ask, what's in it for me, for the customer, for my partner, for my coworker? So think benefit. So that's 5 simple praise steps. Another 5 steps in resolving is pause. PAUSE. Before the conflict resolution, you need to do your homework, prepare and pray before you go. Do your homework, understand the different pros and cons. And then we already talked a lot about affirming. It's very powerful, how to affirm the relationship, affirm their strength, affirm in a positive way with characters, with details, encouraging them. Use to understand, seek to understand from their perspective, what is their need? What is their interest? What is their benefit? How can we address to what their need? And hopefully also address to the team's need collectively. S is to search, right? Hopefully you do some of the research up front. What are some solutions, how you can come up with a way to resolve them? And finally, how to evaluate in an objective way. Right? A lot of times conflict become very difficult if we only think from our own perspective. We want from all different perspectives and then evaluate. So that's number 5, pause. And then the final one is alert. So this is more detailed summary. So we already talked about asking instead of assuming, avoid blaming, avoid getting defensive, you, them, right or wrong. And then one of the very important A is apologize and know when to forgive others, because forgiveness is your own decision. It doesn't mean reconciliation, but if you forgive, you at least feel more relieved, less stressed. If you don't forgive, you suffer the most because they don't really feel your pain when you don't forgive. It's your own problem, right? L is to listen. We could not stress enough the importance of listening, especially active listening. The many skills in active listening, how to rephrase and connect with them in their words, in their emotions. And it's funny, the word listen, if you rearrange it, is the same 6 letter. That's that silent. So listen means God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should listen at least twice as much to see their point of view and try to prioritize right or wrong as lower priority. It's more important on the relationship, how to come to a resolution and listen to each other's brainstorming. E is to express your point of view in a way that is not self-righteous. We use the I statement. You say how you feel instead of pointing and accusing what they are wrong. So you misunderstand me. That's negative, right? You say, I feel like I'm not understood. So that's a powerful I statement. You can always express how you feel. You cannot just accuse people and assume that they are wrong about you. R is to respect, right? So that's very important for relationship, mutual respect without gossiping. And then finally, T is to tame our tongue, tame our emotion, and it takes time. And it's important to be calm. And the sense of humor is very powerful. When you have a sense of humor, it really relaxes the whole atmosphere, easier to look at the conflict. So sometimes I say, oh, there we go again, the Elaine, the high achiever. So, okay, let's relax, just kind of have a sense of humor about your own mistakes. That's very powerful. You're being vulnerable and you're being honest. You're being self-aware and state what your own shortcoming is and still being assertive. And then think about focusing on the present and the future. Learning from the past, but don't keep going back to the past. So those are the last tip. And finally, we heard a lot. All these need practice. So this is my 4H. That's better than the 5G. From your head knowledge that we know a lot, and really apply to your heart conviction, not just 心动 and 感动. So let's have some 行动 in our hands, and not just one time. And I'm very big on healthy habits. So start baby steps, whatever you heard today, and we'll have a 10-minute small group discussion that you could share. So I cover just a portion of the many things on conflict resolution. So at least we covered those in purple. And a few resources. So I've given a few talks on that in English. So it's on our website. I'll show you where it is. So it has more detail. So it's in the calltowork.org website. And it's in the next page. And feel free to join our WeChat that we share various resources. So it's on the page of Elaine Kung resources. And in the bottom section, there are all types of communication talks. And there are 2 that are on conflict resolution, part 1 and part 2. There's communication with your boss. And then we also just launched a brand new Chinese call to work devotion yesterday. Very exciting. It's the first time in our 25 years history. So if you're interested, go online and sign up in the Chinese form, and you'll be receiving it every Monday. Thank God it's Monday. We had the English for the longest time. It's every Wednesday. So you can sign up for both, and the content is different. So this is the English example. And then the Chinese is also posted in this worldwide ministry called Theology of Work, 工作神学. And this has Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, English with 100 theologians. So you see right here, call to work, 职场使命系列. So under the 灵修材料. So the repository is always there. So you can always go there to look. So this is a website, theologyofwork.org. In English, in Chinese, there's a lot of resources for pastors, for Sunday school teachers, for small group leaders, for any videos and such. And it's translated into simplified and traditional Chinese. And we have prayers on our website, how to help us pray when dealing with conflicts at work in English.